All right, so this week we explore the state and the history of the state system. As you know, international politics is the politics that occurs across international boundaries or among states. Traditionally, that has been the primary unit of international affairs. And the state has certain characteristics that are discussed in this week's readings, and you can see in some of my slides. Um, and so the purpose of this week is to give you a good historical understanding of the evolution of the state and the state systems. That is the international system and the principles by which that international system functions. So, in order to understand that, you have to understand the particular nature of the state itself, what it is. It is not synonymous with all forms of authority. There are other types of governing authorities besides states that have existed in human history. So, classical empires, for example, like the Roman Empire, or the Mongolian Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, or the Egyptian Empire, right? Those systems were very different and organized on different principles than the modern state system was. Also, feudal systems where you have divided, overlapping sovereignties are very different than the modern state system. So, we've always, human beings, since they've kind of existed in large scale civilizations, have always had some form of political organization, but that political organization has not always been the state. So, what is the state, right? And I have some slides on this, and it's in the readings. The state has a couple of characteristics. First off, the state is considered sovereign, which means that it exercises exclusive control over its territorial boundaries. Secondly, that sovereignty is territorial in nature, meaning that the laws of the state and the authorities of the state apply up to the border, right? And they are exclusive up to that border. And then when you cross the border, you're in the jurisdiction of another state which has exclusive authority. This is very different than a feudal system where you might have overlapping authorities. You might owe allegiance to multiple organizations or lords or political entities. So here you have a system of organized territorial sovereignty. And to be sovereign, you have to have that kind of exclusive control, but you also have to have the recognition of other sovereign actors. And that's what makes the state system a system. That is, all of the planet except for Antarctica, right? And that all the territory is divided up and allocated to these particular state units. States have a particular bureaucratic structure. You can actually look from state to state and compare them. That's what people do in comparative politics. But you have this exclusive territorial jurisdiction. It's limited by territory and it is exclusive. And you have this notion of mutual recognition. And in order to be a state, an institution has to have both of those characteristics. Now, there are other principles, right, that govern international politics. And the extra reading this week is Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, which tries to articulate a set of other principles by which the state system should function. A lot of those principles have been in the 20th and 21st century widely accepted. Things like, for example, national self-determination, which you will see in several of Wilson's points. The specific settlements that he's proposing are specific to the outcome of the First World War. But the general principle of national self-determination is something that is much more widely accepted than it was even in Wilson's time. And certainly it was not part of the original Westphalian settlement. So this set of readings is trying to get you to think about how the state system has evolved. One of the ways that it has evolved is in terms of the principles by which states view each other as legitimate and articulate the rules by which they govern their relations with each other. And that's why I had you read the Wilson piece. I want you to think about the principles that Wilson is articulating to bring an end to the First World War. Wilson is one of the kind of proto-liberal thinkers. So a lot of these principles will be in line with liberal principles that you encountered a little bit last week in the introduction and certainly will encounter next week. when we look at the theories in more detail. But I want you to read the specific kind of provisions and think about what the principles that are underlie those provisions are, because Wilson is an important thinker in terms of developing things like the principle of national self-determination, which will eventually lead to things like decolonization in the mid-20th century after the end of the Second World War. So in some ways, Wilson is a kind of prophetic figure writing out things that will become parts of the international system later on, and thinking about those and identifying those by reading Wilson's document. Now, Wilson himself is writing at the end or during World War I, trying to think about what the international system should look like after the peace. So this was his peace plan. His 14 points is his peace plan for ending the First World War between the Central Powers, that's Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Turkey, and the Allies, which are Britain, France, and Russia at this point is going to have dropped out of the war. So Britain, France, and the United States and Italy are the main kind of European powers. And the British and the French don't all agree with Wilson's 14 points, but they need help from the Americans at this point in the war, so they're willing to kind of entertain them. And the 14 points do not become the peace plan, but they are Wilson's ideas about how peace should emerge. And there's actually a gap between what Wilson's outlining in the 14 points and the actual peace treaty that ends World War I, the Treaty of Versailles, which incorporates some of Wilson's principles, but also some things that the British and French want, which really more reflect at the time kind of realist thinking about international relations. But I assigned you this piece because I thought it would be a good way for you to see some of the principles of the international system or where they came from, and thinking about that in terms of how those principles have shifted over time. Because if you look at this prior to Wilson, many of the things that Wilson is articulating here are actually not principles that are in the original Westphalian settlement. Wilson's sort of adding them, or they're evolving as people's notions about the state are changing. So the state, which starts off as kind of the personal property of the king, is by the 20th century much more thought to be associated with the citizens or the people of that territory. And so the state, who owns the state and what does the state represent, and therefore what its international politics should be like, has evolved over the course of the development of the state system. So the state system, for the purposes of this class, really starts in 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia, and it moves into the contemporary era today. We still live in the state system, though that state system looks a lot different than it did in 1648. First off, it's not just European. The Europeans sort of exported the state as an institutional form through periods of colonization, and then those colonies became recognized states kind of after 30 years after Wilson, right, with the end of World War II, in this period of decolonization, which occurs between roughly 1947 and 1974. So you can see, like, the mid to late 20th century, most of the things we now call states emerged as sovereign actors in that post-World War II settlement. But I wanted us to focus a little bit on Wilson because the principles seem to have their origins in Wilson's writing on the 14 points. So I want you to read the 14 points and then think about the underlying principles of those points, rather than like worrying specifically about Poland. What does that point actually mean as a governing principle, or what does it suggest a governing principle for the international system should be? So that's this week. And next week, we're going to return more to a theoretical discussion. But this week, looking to focus on the state itself. Hope everything is going well, and I look forward to your discussion posts.